Paper can kill faster than poison. The night Echo arrived, I saw a transfer form that looked perfect until my thumb caught the ink. Wrong texture. Wrong pressure. My pager thumped like a warning you couldn't ignore, buried deep in my scrub pocket like contraband. Dead man switch. Analog buzz. Outside, a storm hammered the ER windows and shook the fluorescent lights until they buzzed in sympathy. The place smelled like bleach, wet raincoats, and burnt coffee. Then a colder scent slid in under it, clean as a knife, bitter almonds. Cyanide had a way of making a room feel suddenly older and meaner. They pushed the gurney into my bay and called it an MVC, like a label could make chaos behave. The guy on the sheet was 28-ish, built like he'd never missed leg day, skin too calm for the mess happening inside him. Blood smeared dark across the linen, and the almond stink rose off it in thin waves every time the air conditioning kicked. His chest had bruises in mirrored patches, too neat to be random, like something heavy and shaped had hugged him hard. Armor bruises. I felt my left knee complain when I stepped closer, the joint grinding like gravel, and I caught myself counting without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The old rotor rhythm in my head. The resident leaned in with hands stacked, already committing to compressions. I saw his shoulders load up for that first shove. The righteous violence of do something my pager kept hammering my ribs. The transfer form fluttered against the rail, clipped like an afterthought. No scuffs, no coffee stains, no fingerprints, too clean for a real night shift. And that timestamp, it sat there like a typo that wanted to get somebody killed. "Start CPR," the resident said, loud enough to sound sure. His eyes didn't meet mine. He was listening to the monitor, to the protocol in his head, to the idea that numbers meant truth. I tasted almonds at the back of my throat and felt my stomach drop a notch. Cyanide didn't care about good intentions. You could crush a man's ribs into confetti and still lose him. Fast. Because the problem wasn't his pump. It was his fuel don't, I said. One word. The resident didn't stop, so I stepped in. My left hand, scarred knuckles from an old IED kiss, closed around his wrist. I twisted just enough to make the joint talk. Cartilage complained. His fingers went slack. He made a surprised sound and tried to yank back, but I turned with him and used his momentum the way they taught us when you didn't have space for heroics. "Move," I snapped, and my voice came out with that dry edge I used when fear wanted to show its teeth. I grabbed a fat needle from the tray, the plastic hub slick under my glove. The patient's skin was cold, sweaty, like touching a fish left out too long. I found the spot by feel, not by lecture, muscle memory from ugly nights. Anatomy mapped into my fingertips. I pushed. Resistance, then a soft give, like puncturing a tough orange. The syringe filled with blood that looked wrong for life, thick, dark, almost black, dragging itself into the barrel like oil. The resident stared, suddenly pale. His hands hovered, useless now, because he finally understood what compressions would have done. Turn that pressure into a rupture. Pop the cage. Flood the wrong spaces. The monitor did a tiny, angry beep. The storm answered with thunder that rolled through the ceiling tiles. My forearm burned from the grip. My knee pulsed where I'd planted too hard. I kept my face flat anyway. Don't die on my shift. The paperwork is a bitch. You can expire at 6:01 a.m. when the day crew clocks in. I said it to the man on the gurney because talking was a leash on panic. The pager buzz slowed, then hit again, like it was reminding me this wasn't just medicine. It was timing. It was custody. It was someone somewhere waiting for a chart to go quiet. Doctor. Thornton arrived like a door slamming. 50. Crisp white coat. Metal frame glasses. iPad already up like a judge's bench. He didn't look at Echo first. His thumb hovered half a second. He looked at my hands, then the needle, then the resident's reddening wrist. His mouth tightened in that careful way administrators practiced, so they didn't say the word Sue out loud. "What the hell is this?" he barked. Heads turned down the trauma lane. Tape paused mid-rip. Someone stopped breathing for a second, just to listen. "He's poisoned," I said, and hated how small it sounded against his certainty cyanide. "CPR will. I don't care what your theory is," Thornton snapped. Eyes flicking to the form, clipped to the rail. Liability lived behind his stare. "Exposure. Comfort care. This patient is not worth the risk." He tapped his iPad with a sharp little jab, like he could sign death with a fingertip. "And whatever you think you're doing it off policy." The storm cracked again. Closer. My pager thumped once more, low and ugly, like a heartbeat you couldn't trust. I watched Thornton's finger hover over the chart. Imagined the words "legal hold" dropping like a steel gate once it was filed. Imagined transfer becoming custody in somebody else's mouth. Thornton pointed without looking up. "You're suspended, Vance." "Step away from the patient." He said it like a final answer. I let my hands come off the rail slow, like the gurney might shock me. My knee shook. My glove smelled like antiseptic, iron, and that bitter almond cold. Echo's chest still moved, barely, and I couldn't tell if the pager was warning me or counting down. A voice on the P, a practiced Vietnamese tone somewhere down the corridor. The silence after Thornton's order felt physical, like a hand on the back of my neck. People pretended not to look at me while they looked anyway. The ER kept moving, because stopping meant thinking. I'd been suspended in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a poisoning, in the middle of a man who still had brain cells firing somewhere behind all that cyanide. I waited until Thornton's shoes carried him toward the charge desk, toward paperwork, toward control. Then I borrowed the hospital's favorite trick, noise. I slapped the code blue button at the West Wing junction and yelled, "Code blue!" West Hall, loud enough to trigger reflexes. The overhead speaker repeated it with cheerful indifference. Footsteps redirected. Thornton's attention snapped away like a dog hearing a whistle. I took Echo's gurney by the rail and pushed. My left knee flared on the first pivot, hot and sharp, and I swallowed the sound. 1, 2, 3. I counted under my breath, timing my steps so the wheels didn't chatter. The corridor past the main bays was dimmer, colder, and it smelled like dust trapped in vents, an older part of the building where machines lived and people didn't. The utility room door didn't fully latch. It caught on swollen paint and bad maintenance. Nothing in this place was fixed unless it made money. I shoved the gurney in anyway and shouldered the door until it sat almost closed. Light leaked through the crack in a thin blade. The air inside was freezer cold and smelled like plastic tubing and stale mop water. My scrub top stuck to my back. The portable dialysis unit sat on a cart, like a suitcase someone regretted packing. I powered it up and it answered with a dry, irritated beep. Then another. Then a fast string of them that sounded like a laugh you didn't want aimed at you. The screen flashed an error I didn't have time to decode. It was supposed to be my clean solution. It wasn't. Echo lay there, heavy and silent, his chest rising shallow. The bitter almond smell clung to him like a second skin. I pressed my fingers to his neck. Pulse, thin, slippery, trying to leave. Out in the West Hall, the code blue chaos kept blooming, muffled but real. The machine kept complaining. I found the manual bulb and wrapped my hand around it. Rubber, cool at first, then warming as my palm pressed in. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. My forearm burned again. The bulb fought back like it had opinions. Sweat broke out cold along my spine and started sliding down in thin, nasty streams. 1, 2, 3. I counted. Not seconds exactly, but beats, my own metronome. The rotor rhythm that never really left. 30 seconds in, my fingers started to tremble. The tendon at my thumb felt like it was being pulled with pliers. My left knee shook where I braced against the cart, pain grinding behind the kneecap. I kept squeezing because stopping would have been the loudest thing in the room. The error beeps kept ticking like a cheap lie detector. Echo's monitor gave a weak twitch, then another, like his heart was arguing its way back into the conversation. Boots sounded in the corridor. Heavy. Slow. A patrol pace. A security guard doing a loop, thinking about coffee, not death. The steps paused outside the door. Keys jingled softly. My lungs locked up on instinct. I shortened my squeezes, made them quieter, tried to pull air through my nose without sounding like a person hiding. The gap under the door showed a slice of shadow shifting, then settling. 1, 2, 3. I kept counting. 58. 59. 60. My arms went rubbery the moment I hit it, like they'd been waiting for permission to fail. Echo's heart rate jumped, ugly and fast. Alive. Relief hit me hard enough to make me dizzy, and I hated it because relief made you careless. The guard shifted his weight once more, keys whispering, and then the boots moved on. The sound faded down the hall. I sagged against the cart, hands cramped into claws. My shirt clung to my ribs. My mouth tasted like metal and almonds. The dialysis unit kept flashing its error like it wanted credit for almost helping. Echo's chest rose deeper now, still shallow, but real. His pulse under my fingers felt less like a rumour. In the corner, behind stacked boxes and a mop bucket, a server monitor blinked awake. Blue light, then tidy lines of data rolled up the screen. A small icon pulsed, and a soft ping sounded tiny, harmless, the kind of sound you'd miss if you weren't already listening for traps. Echo's heart rate had gone strong enough to trigger an automatic upload. A survival packet fired into the cloud. I stared at that ping like it was a muzzle flash. Somewhere out in the stormy night, someone who shouldn't have been watching just got the message that my patient hadn't disappeared. Because now the countdown wasn't 60 seconds. Now it was whoever heard that ping, and how fast they could drive. I was still bent over the cart, forearms trembling, when Echo's eyes snapped open like someone had yanked his strings. Not a slow wake-up, not a confused blink. Few, predator-wide, whites showing, pupils pinned. His hand shot out and caught the IV line like it was a garrote he'd been issued in basic. The tubing whipped around my throat and cinched down hard. Plastic bit skin. The line rolled across my windpipe and flattened it. Air turned into a thin, useless hiss. My vision tunneled at the edges. Not dramatic, just physics. Oxygen got rationed. Brain started making bargains. I didn't scream. Screaming was wasted air. I heard my own pulse instead, loud in my ears, and I counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The old rotor rhythm kept time while my body tried to panic. Echo hauled me in close with a strength that didn't match, just woke up from poisoning. His forearm locked against my throat like he'd practiced it on a mat 1,000 times. The utility room shrank. Cold air, stale mop water stink, old blood in the grout, dried and forgotten. The dialysis unit kept chirping its error beeps like it was enjoying the show. His face was inches from mine. Sweat and almonds and copper. Eyes glassy, wild, but not stupid. His jaw clenched. Veins stood out on his neck like cables. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to end a threat fast, the way people do when their world is reduced to alive and not alive. My hands went where training lived, not where fear lived. I hooked 2 fingers under the tubing to buy a sliver of space, just enough so it didn't fully crush cartilage, and shifted my weight off my bad knee before it buckled. Pain flared, sharp and nauseating, but pain was information. I used it. Echo's grip tightened when I moved. He felt it. He adjusted. That told me something too. This wasn't a flailing patient. This was reflex with intelligence behind it. Survival paranoia on rails. My gaze flicked past his shoulder, because staring at the weapon never helps. A faded warning sign on the wall, FOD, foreign object debris, peeling at the corners like it had been there since the building was new. The irony almost made me laugh, which would have been a dumb way to die. Strangled by hospital tubing under a sign about random crap that shouldn't be here. I slid my right hand up, slow, like I was surrendering. My thumb found the notch under Echo's jaw, that soft spot where nerve and pressure and pain all lived too close together. I pressed in hard, not a jab, a deliberate sink, like pushing a tack into rubber. Echo's eyes went even wider. His throat made a broken sound. Muscles in his forearm spasms, not from weakness, from wiring. The choke loosened a fraction. I kept pressure, increasing, twisting just enough to make his body choose between holding me and holding itself together. He broke. Echo's hands flew to his own neck like the pain had turned him inward. The IV line slackened and slid off my throat, leaving a burning strip of raw skin that already felt swollen. I dragged in air, and it came in ragged. Ugly pulls. Cold room air scraped my trachea like sandpaper. My voice didn't come back right away. I coughed once, wet, and tasted blood, mine or his. I couldn't tell, and I didn't have the luxury of caring. Echo folded over the edge of the gurney and hacked. Thick, dark spit hit the floor in strings. He wasn't thanking me. He wasn't apologizing. His whole body was still in fight, even while his lungs tried to quit. I watched him with that clinical part of my brain that stayed calm because it had nowhere else to go. He'd been hypoxic and poisoned and flatlined, and he'd still snapped into a military choke like it was his default language. That meant training. It meant someone had wired him to treat touch as capture. That meant he wasn't just some unlucky crash victim. I already knew that from the bruises. Now my throat knew it too. I reached for the wall phone on instinct, fingers shaking. Call 911. Call anybody with a badge and a conscience. The hospital line was grimy under my fingertips, plastic worn smooth. I lifted the receiver. Echo's hand slapped it down, hard, fast. No hesitation. His palm hit the cradle, and the plastic cracked a little. He leaned toward me, eyes still fierce, voice wrecked and hoarse around blood and poison. Local cops. Dispatch is bought. You call, we all die. The words landed heavier than the choke. He wasn't telling a story, he was cutting off an escape hatch. My mind ran the math in a blink. If dispatch was compromised, the first siren could be the last sound we heard. The cloud ping I'd just triggered wasn't a flare. It was a dinner bell. Echo sagged back, panting, one hand on his throat like he couldn't decide whether to protect it or crush it. His gaze snapped to the door, the crack of light under it, listening the way hunted animals listened. I swallowed, and my throat screamed. The IV burn felt like a hot wire wrapped around my neck. In the distance, over the hospital's constant noise, the PA system popped with static. The same bright, calm voice it always used, like cheerfulness could disinfect anything. Dr. Thornton, xin mời ra sảnh chính tiếp đón đặc vụ liên bang. Echo's eyes cut to mine. For the first time there was something like certainty in them. They weren't coming for paperwork. They were coming for him. And I was still the idiot standing between a patient and the world that wanted him filed away. The ER looked like it always did, under fluorescent light, too clean on the surface, too filthy underneath. White tiles, stainless rails, that institutional hum like the building was chewing electricity. The storm outside kept throwing rain at the glass, but in here the air was dry and cold, scrubbed until it smelled like bleach and tired. I stayed where shadows pooled behind a supply rack near the main lane, not hiding like a cartoon burglar, just not presenting. Years in a helicopter taught you that standing in the open was a choice, and sometimes it was the wrong one. 4 men walked in like they owned the place. Black windbreakers with FBI in bright letters. Nylon fabric rasped against itself with every step, that nylon rasp. They didn't scan the room like lost feds. They took angles. They stopped with space between them, forming a staggered line that let each man see past the next. Hand signals flicked 2 fingers, a short chop, a small circle silent coordination that belonged to people who'd done this before. Thornton came out to meet them. iPad hugged to his chest like a vest. He adjusted his glasses, forced his face into neutral professionalism. He looked relieved, almost. Like the law, had finally arrived to take the liability off his hands. The lead man held out a folder. Thick paper, crisp edges, the kind of document that made administrators stand straighter. I caught a glimpse of the header as Thornton took it. Form 42. Thornton didn't rush. He never rushed when ink was involved. He flipped pages with careful fingers, nails clean, hands unused to blood. Pen scratched lightly as he traced signatures. He leaned into the seals, squinting as if the right stamp could absolve him of everything that happened on his watch. The men didn't fill the space with chatter. No introductions. No badges shoved in faces. They watched. One of them stood just off to Thornton's right shoulder, not threatening, just placed. Another drifted closer to the exits, eyes on the flow of traffic. 2 controlled the center line like they were managing a corridor, not a hospital. Echo lay on a gurney in the open lane now, head turned slightly, eyes closed. If you didn't know him, you'd think he was still out. If you did know him, you'd notice the tiny tension in his forearm, the way his fingers hung a little too ready, like a spring held down by discipline. Thornton exhaled through his nose, a thin, legal sigh. He looked up, and for a second, I saw the man behind the policy tired, scared, desperate to be correct. Then his mouth formed the words like a ritual. Liability. Exposure. This Form 42 is completely in order. My stomach dropped. Not because Thornton was evil. Because he was predictable. Paper said federal, and his whole brain relaxed. He handed control away like it was a safety switch. The team moved without hurry. The gurney's brake clicked off. Wheels squeaked. Nylon jackets whispered when they shifted weight. I watched hands and gear, because gear didn't lie the way paperwork did. The 3rd man in line had trauma shears clipped high on his left chest, angled like a medic, but his pistol sat on his right hip. Not center, not cross-draw. A right-side holster that would foul a clean draw if his dominant hand was right. That mismatch wasn't a fashion mistake. It was the kind of small wrong you got when you wore a costume over habits you couldn't erase. He also had Celox tucked into a pocket field gauze, the kind you carried when you expected red. You didn't bring that to a routine transfer, you brought it to a job. My throat still burned from the IV line. I swallowed anyway. I didn't move. Thornton was standing in the open, nodding along, relieved to be led. Staff parted like water. Nobody wanted to challenge men with big letters on their backs. The gurney rolled. Echo's hand dangled off the side, loose, fingers relaxed, and then tiny, almost invisible, his index finger tapped against the metal rail. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. S-C-O. S-C. It hit me harder than any speech could have. Not because it was dramatic, because it was quiet, because it meant he was awake, aware, trapped inside the act, because it meant he trusted me just enough to ask. The men guided the gurney toward the hall that led to the exits. Their hand signals kept snapping tight, efficient, bored. Thornton trailed beside them, still talking to the lead man in that careful admin tone, like he could talk his way into not being blamed. I backed up 1 step, then another, keeping the supply rack between me and the line of sight. My bad knee complained softly. The fluorescent glare made everything look flat and harmless, like a brochure. It wasn't. Behind me, mounted on the wall, was a red glass box, the kind you broke when you ran out of choices. I let my hand drift toward it, not committing yet, just finding distance and timing and consequences. Echo's gurney disappeared past the corner. The nylon jackets whispered after it, and the only honest thing in the whole room was the sound of my own heartbeat, speeding up like it already knew we were out of paperwork and into war. My hand hovered over the red glass box, like it was a confession waiting to happen. The hall was too bright, too normal, all that clean, fluorescent light pretending we weren't about to get people killed. Nylon jackets whispered around the corner with Echo's gurney. Thornton's voice carried after them, all clipped syllables and paperwork certainty. My throat still felt skinned from the IV line, raw every time I swallowed. Outside, thunder rolled again, and the windows trembled like they were nervous too. There was a yellow-black warning sign bolted to the steel door beside me, ripped at one corner. Jet blast. It made no sense in a hospital, which was exactly why I noticed it. Old construction, old routes, old rules that got pasted over and forgotten. My pager sat heavy against my ribs. Dead man's switch, my brain kept calling it, like naming the thing made it less real. I pictured Echo's finger tapping SOS on cold metal. I pictured him rolling out the front doors and never existing again, except as a closed file. I also pictured the other option. Lock the place down. Lock myself in with 4 men who moved like trained predators. Point of no return. The kind of choice you made once, then paid for forever. I moved before my nerves could bargain me back into being a good employee. Fist. Glass. The red box exploded under my knuckles, with a crack that went straight through my teeth. Shards bit into my skin and stayed there, little hot splinters that made my palms slick. I didn't stop to pick them out. I yanked the cover open, swiped my nurse badge through the slot, and drove my thumb down on the infection lockdown button hard enough to bruise myself. The siren hit like a physical blow, a rising, screaming wail that chewed through the ER's hum and made everyone flinch on instinct. Red lights snapped on in strips along the ceiling. Doors down the corridor started to cycle, seals engaging with dull clunks. For a second the air felt tighter, like the building inhaled and held it. Thornton saw it happen. His head whipped around, glasses catching the light. His face went white with a different kind of terror. Not for Echo, for the system, for the property, for what this looked like on a report. He sprinted toward the glass partition, palm-slapping it as if he could press me back through it. His mouth moved, shouting, but the siren drowned most of it, leaving only the shape of panic. Hydraulics answered with a sound I felt in my bones. A long, angry hiss. Pistons groaned. The lead-lined steel door overhead started to descend, slow at first, then with unstoppable weight. It scraped down its track like a guillotine made for buildings, The floor vibrated under my boots. My knee buckled from the shockwave, pain spiking sharp and bright, and I caught myself on the wall. The assassins reacted fast. No yelling, no surprise theatrics, just motion. The lead man's hand flashed a signal. 2 of them snapped their pistols up, muzzles tracking not people, but systems. One squeezed off a suppressed burst at the electrical panel near the door control. The shot sounded like someone clapping a book shut in a quiet room. The panel sparked, then detonated in a white-blue flash that turned my retinas inside out. The steel door slammed the final inches with a deep, wet thud, like a submarine hatch sealing. The air pressure shifted. You could feel the room become a container. On the other side of the bulletproof glass, Thornton hit it again and again with the heel of his hand, his voice finally punching through between siren pulses. "You can't!" he screamed, and the rest drowned in noise and red light. Then the power went. White fluorescence died mid-buzz. The hall dropped into a thick, instant darkness that felt like getting blindfolded. For half a heartbeat, the only light was lightning through distant windows and the dying spit of sparks from the ruined panel. Then emergency red stabilized, dim and ugly, bathing everything in the color of dried blood. The ventilation stopped. The HVAC's constant breath cut off, and the air went stale fast, heavy with disinfectant sweat and that faint, bitter almond ghost. The siren fell into a lower, pulsing tone, like a heart monitor for the building itself. Somewhere above, a speaker clicked on. A calm, automated voice started reciting consequences. Infection lockdown initiated. Federal response in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. A countdown that sounded like salvation until you pictured what happened in those 10 minutes. 4 predators. 1 poisoned target. 1 busted knee. My hand throbbed where glass was still embedded. I flexed my fingers and felt sharp little needles answer. Good. Pain meant I was awake. Across the corridor, the men in FBI jackets moved into the dark without a word. I heard the soft metallic snick of a round, chambering, quiet and final. In the red gloom, their silhouettes weren't people anymore. They were shapes with intent. And I was the idiot who had just locked the cage from the inside. Darkness didn't feel like a lack of light. It felt like pressure, like the ICU hallway had filled with something thick and black and heavy, and every breath had to push through it. Emergency red leaked out of wall strips and exit signs, not enough to see faces, just enough to see edges. My lungs still burned from earlier, throat scraped raw, and sweat cooled fast without the HVAC, turning clammy on my spine. The siren outside the sealed door pulsed low now, a distant animal. 10 minutes. The building was counting down in its own calm voice. Echo was on the gurney 10 feet ahead, a dark mass under a sheet, his weight suddenly real again now that adrenaline had nowhere to hide. The 4 men moved somewhere in the same corridor. Silent, disciplined. I couldn't see them, but I could feel the way the air shifted when someone stepped. My bad knee twitched, a warning tremor, and I started my own count. 1, 2, 3. Not comfort. Just cadence. Just keeping my brain from scattering. I slid to Echo's side, fingers finding the rail, and braced for the lift like I was about to deadlift my own bad decisions. I got an arm under his shoulders and hauled. He was heavy in the honest way, 80 kilos of muscle and limp limbs that didn't help you. My left knee took the load first and made a wet, grinding complaint deep behind the kneecap. Cartilage didn't scream. It whispered, "It told you the bill was coming." I shifted my stance, tried to take weight through my hips, but the hallway was narrow and the gurney was a loud piece of furniture. Wheels squeaked, metal ticked. Every tiny sound felt like it travelled for miles in that sealed, dead air. Echo's head lolled against my shoulder. His breath brushed my neck, warm and uneven. He smelled like antiseptic, almonds and blood that had been hanging around too long. My hand, the one with glass still in it, slipped on the sheet. A shard bit deeper and sent a bright sting up my forearm. I didn't stop. Stopping was a decision. I didn't have time for decisions. I dragged him off the gurney and into a half-carry, half-drag boot skidding on linoleum that suddenly felt slick. 1, 2, 3. My count stayed steady while my body shook. Ahead, a door sign glowed faintly under emergency red. Supply. It was the only kind of room that ever had something useful. My knee buckled on the third step. Not fully, just enough to tilt my center of gravity the wrong way. Pain flashed hard, white-hot, and my grip on Echo's weight slipped. We staggered. My shoulder slammed the wall. A cart beside the supply door rattled, and my hand clipped the top tray by accident. Metal hit metal with a sharp slap. The tray tipped. Instruments and packaged supplies skated, then fell. The sound when the whole thing hit the floor was pure betrayal. A clean, chattering crash that echoed down the corridor and came back at me like a shout. I froze with Echo half in my arms, half dragging on the floor. My chest tried to suck in air too loud. I clamped my jaw and breathed through my nose, shallow, controlled. 1, 2, 3. The count was a thin rope in my head. In the dark behind us, rubber soles changed pattern. Not faster, just redirected. Tactical steps, measured, angling toward the noise. The air got colder in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. My skin prickled. They'd been sweeping. Now they'd found the point. I hauled Echo again, muscles tearing in slow motion. My knee felt like someone was driving a screwdriver under the patella with every shift. The supply room door was right there. My hand found the handle. Cold metal, greasy from 100 gloves. I pulled. The latch resisted. Just for a heartbeat. Enough to make me imagine dying in a hallway over a stuck door. It opened with a reluctant squeal, and I shoved Echo inside, shoulder first, then stumbled after him. The room smelled like cardboard, alcohol wipes and dust. Shelves rose on both sides, packed tight. The door tried to swing back. I caught it and eased it closed. Slow, because a slam would be suicide. My hands shook so hard the knob rattled anyway. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Close. Too close. Silence settled again, thicker than before, and my ears strained for the smallest clue. I could hear Echo's breathing, harsh and wet. I could hear my own heart hammering like it was trying to punch out of my ribs. The 10-minute countdown kept running somewhere beyond the walls, indifferent. Then a soft, metallic tap touched the door from the other side. Not a knock. A test. Something long and hard, like the end of a suppressed barrel, kissed the metal once. I held my breath until my vision sparked, and I realized the only thing between us and them was a cheap interior lock and whatever luck I had left. The door didn't explode. It argued. A slow, stubborn flex in the frame, plastic creaking like a cheap bone about to crack. Something metal kissed the panel once, then again soft taps, patient, measuring. The supply room air tasted like dust and alcohol wipes, and fear that had gone stale. Emergency red leaked under the door and turned the floor into a dark smear. Echo lay in the corner where I dragged him, heavy and half-breathing, every inhale wet and wrong. My throat still burned from the smoke earlier, and my knee felt like it had a screwdriver wedged behind the kneecap. Silence outside. No chatter, no FBI, just controlled breathing and boots that didn't squeak. The kind of quiet that meant they already decided how this ended. I scanned shelves fast. Saline bags, crash cart, defib pads in foil, alcohol, calcium, harmless stuff, unless you got desperate. Target fixation floated up from some old part of my brain like a label slapped on a body bag. People with a gun and a goal stared at the goal. They forgot the floor. They forgot the puddle. They forgot anything that wasn't you. The lock clicked again. A millimeter. A promise. I moved before my body could second-guess it. I ripped 3 saline bags open with both hands. Plastic tore with a wet snap, cold fluid dumping over my wrists and running down my forearms. The chill made my fingers clumsy. I flung the first bag low, then the next, then the third, emptying 1,000 milliliters at a time onto the linoleum until the doorway area turned into a shallow lake that reflected red light like spilled blood. I shoved the crash cart into position and climbed onto its rubber mat, using it like an island. My left knee protested with a deep grind when I shifted my weight, but it held. I tore the defib pads out of their packaging. Foil flashed, then crumpled. I yanked the metal cores free 2 thin discs, slick and cold, and tossed them into the saline puddle. They landed with soft slaps, sank and vanished under the surface. I twisted the defib unit's dial up with a shaking hand, cranking it until my thumb landed on 360. The door came in hard boot and shoulder together. The latch popped with a sharp crack. A man filled the frame in a black jacket, pistol already up, muzzle locked on me. He didn't scan the floor. He didn't look for traps. He saw my chest and nothing else. I heard myself whisper it. Not smug, just clinical. Target fixation. His boot splashed straight into the saline. Chock. The room flashed blue-green like lightning in a closet. The saline puddle jumped, went alive, and the current tore through the man's leg and up his body in a brutal instant. Muscles seized all at once. Hands clawed, jaw clamped, shoulders locking into a hard, ugly posture like the nervous system had been hijacked. His scream came out broken, chopped into pieces by spasms. The pistol jerked toward the ceiling. Trigger finger stuck. Muzzle useless. Ozone slammed my nose sharp, metallic, like licking a battery. The man's boots scraped as his legs tried to move and couldn't. He toppled sideways and hit the floor with a heavy slap that I felt through the cart. The puddle trembled around him in little ripples that wouldn't stop. A shadow appeared behind the doorway, then slid back. The others didn't rush in. They adjusted, quiet hands, smarter angles. A suppressed shot popped, soft as a book closing, and a shelf behind me spat glass. Bottles tinkled like nervous teeth. I dropped off the cart and landed wrong. My knee lit up white hot. I bit down and grabbed the alcohol bottle, dumped it near the doorway, and the fumes punched up into my eyes. I ripped a packet of medical calcium open and flung the powder into the alcohol. White, smoke, bloomed, fast chemical. Thick, hungry. It rolled low, then climbed, wiping out the doorway, and my vision at the same time. The burn hit my lungs like ground glass. I coughed once, and it tore. The next breath felt like inhaling shattered plastic. Tears streamed down my face and made the red light smear. I dragged Echo deeper into the room. Using shelves as cover, I couldn't see any more. His body was dead weight, 80 kilos of muscle that didn't help. My grip slipped on his shirt. My palm stung where glass was still embedded. The smoke turned everything into guesses, shapes, shadows, movement. Ozone mixed with alcohol and chalk, until my mouth tasted like metal and bleach. Another suppressed pop. Something punched into cardboard. A box thudded down near my shoulder. I kept pulling Echo until my knee buckled, and I dropped to the floor beside him, chest heaving in harsh, ragged pulls. My lungs were on fire. My throat was raw. The room sounded far away, like I was underwater. Echo twitched under my hands. At first I thought it was the vibration of boots outside the smoke. Then his body jerked again harder, seizure-like. His head knocked a shelf edge with a dull thunk. His breath hitched. His jaw clenched. The monitor, half buried under supplies, chirped a warning beep that cut through the fog like a needle. Cyanide plus stress plus whatever electricity and fumes did to a body already losing. It was a bad recipe. His chest tightened, then shook. A wheeze tried to become a breath and failed. The monitor chirped faster, frantic. I pressed fingers to his neck. Pulse was there. Then it wasn't. Then it came back weak and slippery like it wanted to crawl away. The smoke thickened. I couldn't pull a full breath without gagging. I coughed until my ribs hurt, and I tasted blood. Somewhere in the whiteout, a shape moved silent, close, disciplined. They were still coming, stepping around their fallen man without a word. Echo jerked one last time, stiffening, then went slack like someone unplugged him. The monitor screamed a long, flat tone, and in the choking white fog with 3 predators still moving, I realized my trap had bought me seconds, just long enough for Echo's heart to decide it was done. The flatline sound was a straight, endless scream that made my teeth ache. It didn't rise. It didn't wobble. It just held, cold and cruel, like a verdict. The lead-lined X-ray room swallowed most noise, but that tone cut through everything anyway. It filled the space the way smoke did no corners left. We'd stumbled in here out of the chemical fog, because the walls were thick and the door felt like it belonged on a vault. Red emergency light washed over the imaging table and turned Echo's skin the color of old bruises. The air still carried chalky burn from alcohol and calcium. Every breath made my lungs feel like they were lined with sand. My throat rasped. My knee screamed when I climbed up beside him. I didn't negotiate with it. Echo lay on the table, mouth open, chest still. Armor-pattern bruises stood out under red light, like a map of where he'd been hit before he ever reached my bay. My hands were slick with sweat, and somebody's blood. I stacked them on his sternum and locked my elbows straight. 1, 2, 3. I counted out loud because silence was worse. I pushed. His chest fought back, then gave. Cartilage popped with a wet snap that turned my stomach. I kept the rhythm. Down. Up. Down. The table squealed under the force. Sweat dripped off my face onto his ribs. The flatline tone wavered for a heartbeat, then held again like it was mocking me. Each compression was a broadcast. Meat and bone and the metal frame complaining. The sound bounced off lead walls and came back at me accusing. Outside the door, the hallway stayed quiet in that predator way. No coughing, no yelling, just movement that didn't want to be heard. I could feel them out there the way you feel. A storm coming through pressure change. 1, 2, 3. My arms started to fail fast. Triceps burned. Wrists ached. My palms slipped and I adjusted without stopping, replanting on broken ribs like it was normal. My lungs burned so hard I couldn't pull a full breath. I dragged air in anyway, shallow, ugly. If I paused, he was gone. If I kept going, I was telling them exactly where to find us. A faint scrape came from the hall. Something heavy dragged along linoleum. Then the plastic crinkle of tape being peeled. My stomach knotted. I kept compressing. 1, 2, 3. My voice broke on the numbers. I tasted blood. I didn't stop. The monitor stuttered, once one tiny blip, then flat again. I leaned harder, using body weight because muscle was done. Another rib snapped with a crack that sounded like stepping on a branch in the dark. Echo didn't flinch. He couldn't. The scrape outside stopped. A soft clack followed something being set against the door. My eyes flicked to the seam. Low, near the floor. A blocky shape pressed to the metal like a parasite. C4 wasn't loud when it arrived. It was patient. 1, 2, 3. The door shivered first, a tiny vibration that you felt in bone before you heard it. Then the blast hit concussive, brutal, not cinematic. The lead-lined door bucked inward with a deep metallic groan. Dust spit from the frame. The imaging table jumped under my hands. I almost lost my rhythm, caught it by pure reflex, and kept going because my body didn't know another option. 1, 2, 3. The gap at the door widened. Cold air rushed in carrying gun oil and burnt wiring. A shadow slid into that opening, pistol up, muzzle hunting for my head. Another shadow stayed back, controlling the angle. No words. No drama. Gunfire erupted in the corridor, suppressed pops first, then louder cracks as somebody answered with a bigger gun. Muzzle flashes stuttered at the doorway gap, lighting the room in harsh white bursts. The sound of rounds hitting tile came through like hail. My compressions kept time through it all, wet and mechanical. Then over the chaos glass exploded somewhere outside, a huge, violent crash like ice breaking. The 10-minute countdown I'd started with my own stupid hand reached its end. The outer ballistic glass blew inward, and Federal SWAT came through the opening on ropes, bodies dropping fast, faces hidden, movements all muscle memory and zero compassion. They didn't arrive like angels. They arrived like machinery. They flooded the corridor with white light and gunfire, and the assassins finally had to move for real. The hallway turned into a grinder. Short bursts, hard commands, bodies hitting walls. The assassins returned fire with cold discipline, trying to reposition. SWAT erased them anyway. I stayed on Echo's chest, counting. 1, 2, 3. The monitor caught a wobble, ugly, jagged, then another. Not a clean rhythm. A twitch of life dragging itself back, while bullets traded outside a lead-lined door. My arms shook. My shoulders cramped. My knee slipped and sent pain spearing up my leg. I bit down and kept the rhythm until my hands felt numb. A red dot appeared on my forehead. Not metaphor, not imagination. A tiny circle of heat without heat that made my scalp tighten. My whole body froze mid-compression, palms still planted on Echo's broken ribs. A voice cut through everything, hard and flat, from behind a rifle somewhere I couldn't see. Hands in the air, step back slowly. My breath caught. My hands hovered, still touching Echo like I could shield him with skin. The red dot didn't move. Neither did I. And the hallway outside, full of smoke and gunfire, and men who didn't care about paperwork, went suddenly quiet enough that I could hear Echo's heart struggle into a jagged, ugly rhythm, alive, but not safe, with a sniper's laser nailed to my forehead like a signature I never agreed to sign. Blue and red strobes kept washing the lobby in dumb, repeating colour, like the building was trying to reboot itself. Yellow police tape cut the ER off down the hall, fluttering every time a door opened. The air smelled like wet concrete, burnt wiring, and bleach working overtime. My scrub top had dried blood on it in stiff flakes. When I shifted, it crackled. The handcuffs were worse, cold steel biting into the soft part of my wrists. Not sharp, just relentless. Every tiny movement made the cuffs grind, metal on bone, and my nerves kept buzzing after the firefight like they forgot how to shut down. I sat at a stainless table with my hands in front of me, chained short. A paper cup of water sweated beside a clipboard. I didn't touch it. My throat still felt skinned from tubing and smoke. My left palm still had glass in it, little needles that lit up when I flexed. Beyond the glass doors, rain fell in thin sheets and the parking lot lights turned it into glitter. Inside, radios murmured. Boots scuffed, and somewhere a mop squeaked, like a punchline nobody wanted. A federal agent sat across from me and watched without expression. Clean jacket, clean eyes, the kind of calm that came from always being the person with options. He opened a folder and started turning pages like he was reading weather. Name. I gave it. Employment. I gave that too, even though it was already dead. His pen tapped once per question. Where were you standing? Why did you trigger lockdown? Who authorized you? The questions were mechanical. The answers didn't matter unless they could be stapled to a charge. Behind him, through a side window, body bags sat in a row under harsh light, black plastic zipped up like punctuation. No one thanked me. No one said good job. The agent didn't even pretend he might. He wasn't here to hand out medals. He was here to close a file without getting blood on his sleeves. The adrenaline drain hit in waves. My hands shook, then went numb, then shook again. My knee throbbed, swollen and loose, like a hinge with grit in it. I counted without meaning to 1, 2, 3, because it kept my breathing from turning into a cough. Thornton appeared on the far side of the lobby with 2 administrators and a woman in a charcoal suit I'd never seen on the floor. Board level. She held a tablet like it was a weapon. Thornton kept adjusting his glasses with fingers that wouldn't stop. His white coat was smeared at the cuff. He looked smaller without his pad shield. The woman spoke in a voice built for conference rooms. Dr. Elias Thornton, you signed and executed a federal transfer order that has been determined fraudulent. this resulted in catastrophic loss, property damage, and public exposure. She didn't raise her volume. She didn't need to. Effective immediately. Your employment is terminated. Security will escort you out. Thornton's mouth opened, ready to spit out the usual liability, exposure, policy. Nothing came. His throat bobbed once. The signatures were valid, he finally said, thin and stunned. The seal? The seal was forged, she cut in. No heat, just fact. The system he worshipped had just eaten him, neat and quiet. The agent across from me slid a single page onto the table. Heavy stock, official letterhead, my name printed clean above words that made my stomach go cold. Permanent revocation. Unsafe conduct. Violation of hospital safety protocols. He set a pen beside it. Sign. I didn't argue. Quiet dignity didn't mean pride. It meant you didn't give them more material than they already had. I took the pen with cuffed hands, awkward, and wrote my name in a line that still counted as consent. The agent took the paper back without comment, clipped it into his folder like a receipt. Thornton was already being walked toward the doors, eyes fixed on nothing. Dawn came like a bad compromise. The rain thinned to mist, and the air outside was cold enough to sting my lungs. Someone handed me a cardboard box with my name scribbled on it in marker. My personal effects. A badge. A cheap stethoscope. A half-empty bottle of ibuprofen. Civilian scraps. My wrists ached where the cuffs had been, skin raised in red lines. My knee made me limp across the lot. Cruisers idled with their light bars still going, still washing everything in blue and red like the world couldn't decide what color this was. The hospital doors breathed people in and out like nothing happened. Echo was gone. No gurney, no chart. No proof he'd ever been here except scorch marks on tile and a busted frame down the hall. The agent didn't walk me to my car. Nobody did. The system had finished with me. I stopped at the edge of the lot with the box cutting into my forearm and listened to the building hum behind the glass. Yellow tape still fluttered. Paper still ruled. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a license. I didn't have a clean story. The rain outside kept falling. Seattle at dawn looked like somebody erased the world and forgot to redraw it. Fog sat low and thick over the lot, turning the streetlights into pale halos and swallowing the hospital behind me in grey. Cold cut through my scrub top and stuck to my skin. My breath came out in short clouds that tasted like smoke and bleach, and the chalky burns still stuck in my lungs. The cardboard box dug into my forearm, corners damp, the cheap corrugation softening in the mist. Everything I'd owned as civilian nurse fit in that square badge, stethoscope, a pen, a bottle of ibuprofen stupidly light for how heavy the night had been. Inside the building, paperwork was already happening. Reports, statements, insurance calls. Somebody was already typing incident into a form and selecting checkboxes that made it feel solvable. None of it cared that my knee was swollen and unstable, that my wrists were raw, that swallowing still hurt. The system loved clean forms. It hated blood, it hated mess, it hated people who didn't wait to be authorized. Gravel crunched behind the fog, slow and deliberate, like something big rolling in under its own rules. Headlights cut 2 pale tunnels through the mist. An SUV eased into view, black and squared off, moving too smooth for anything civilian. The stance was wrong weight low, suspension firm, like it was carrying armor that wasn't listed on any registration. The tires gripped wet pavement without hiss, run flat, no drama. My eyes ran the thing the way they used to run an aircraft before a bad landing. Panel gaps tight. No chrome, no cheap trim. The windshield looked slightly warped at the edges, a subtle distortion you only noticed if you'd ever sat behind thick glass. The hood sat a hair higher than it should, like there was extra mass under it. The undercarriage clearance told me reinforced, not lifted, reinforced. It stopped a few feet from me and didn't idle rough. The rear passenger window started to descend, slow and heavy. Not the quick zip of a normal car, a controlled drop with a soft mechanical whine, 3 inches of ballistic glass sliding down, thick enough to make the air change when it moved. Warm air spilled out, mixed with the smell of real coffee. A small, ridiculous detail that hit me hard. The fog pressed in around the vehicle, isolating it from the rest of the lot like we'd stepped into a separate room. Echo sat in the back seat, not in a suit, not clean, not saved. One arm was in a sling, wrapped in gauze, already showing spots. The strap cut into his shoulder, and he kept adjusting it with 2 fingers like it annoyed him more than it hurt. His face had that pale, tight look of somebody still fighting poison on the inside. When he inhaled, his chest hesitated, and then he coughed short, controlled, wet. The kind of cough you tried to keep private. He watched me the way he watched doors. His free hand offered a small black coffee cup from the seat. Not friendly, not cruel, calibrated. His eyes flicked to my wrists, to the red lines, to my left hand where the IED scar lived, and then away like he'd finished a checklist. "Get in," he said. A thick folder slid out of the dark and hit my box with a solid thump, heavy paper. Not hospital forms, dense stock. Stiff, the kind that stayed flat no matter how sweaty your hands got. A red stamp on the cover. Classified. My fingers tingled, just holding it, like the weight carried heat. "Black Project," he said, voice hoarse. "They need a flight medic." Another cough tried to break through. He swallowed it down. "You broke their toys tonight, that counts." I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The offer had shape. Work where my private rule wasn't a crime, where protocol didn't mean let him die clean. "No more Form 42, he said flat. "No more pretending the paper's in charge." I stared at the folder, then at my own hands. Blood under the nails. Glass still biting my palm. My knee throbbing like a timer. The joint loose in a way that promised a long limp if I tried to keep living like a normal person. The box felt like a costume prop now. Something a different version of me would carry while she filled out unemployment forms and learned how to sleep without counting. That life was already gone. It had been gone the moment I hit infection lockdown and heard the steel door slam like a judgment. Echo waited. No pitch, no reassurance, just time and a running engine. The coffee smell drifted out again, warm and unfair. And for a second I wanted something simple. A cup that didn't taste like disinfectant and shame. Sarcasm did what it always did, kept me from cracking in public. "You got decent coffee in there. I'm dying for a cup that doesn't reek of bleach." A flicker crossed his face. Not a smile. More like recognition that I was still me, even like this. I walked to the trash can by the curb, a dented steel thing beaded with mist, and dropped the cardboard box in. It hit bottom with a hollow thud that sounded like closing a drawer. I kept the folder. My knee screamed when I stepped up into the SUV. The door shut with a heavy, sealed sound of armor. The fog pressed against the glass and turned the outside world into nothing. The engine rolled forward, smooth, and the hospital vanished behind us like it had never existed. Echo coughed once more, quiet, and the SUV swallowed the sound and kept moving.